Fleeting Shadows by Kate Alice Marshall. And this is a book that I picked up at the library. We know I do not read, I listen, but I have been looking for a ghost story. I thought this one sounded pretty spooky, and it was, for all intents and purposes. I read it in a day only because it needs to go back to the library. If given my druthers, I would have taken more time. There were moments towards the end where I started to skim. The conversation in the scenes were slowing down the momentum. Like, we were really building towards the end only for conversations and certain things to be happening, and I was like, I'm just not invested enough to want to partake in this, so I would skip until the momentum picked up again. But this Fleeting Shadows, ultimately, in retrospect, I liked it. While I was reading it, however, and like right when I finished, I was not going to recommend this book. I was not impressed by this book. It was really strong in the beginning, but I thought that it got a little muddy at times. It's redeemed by the end, because of the end where things finally make sense. It's like you need a key in order to figure out the puzzle. Once we got that key, it was like, oh, okay. But in the meantime, I would have to reread passages, and I greatly dislike doing that. I greatly dislike the momentum of my reading to get interrupted, and it's all because of the spooky nature of it. In order for it to be scary, it literally does not make sense. Like, you don't know what's up, what's down, who's who, who's not. That was unenjoyable for me. I felt like what I wanted more of was the spookiness. And the one thing that the characters in this book kept saying was, there are no ghosts. They're not ghosts, they're figments, because the whole deal is basically the place is haunted, and it's haunted by this evil force, and the evil force will take on the physical attributes of another being. So they're not ghosts, it's just this dark force taking on the face of somebody else in order to speak to you. And that's still really cool, but it's kind of like in Harry Potter, where Snape says that legilimency is not reading your mind, and Harry's like, well, it still sounds a lot like reading your mind to me. It still felt very ghosty to me. I had trouble accepting this explanation of they're not ghosts, they're figments. That out of the way, the end did redeem all of the confusing parts. And what I particularly liked, I can't get into too much because I would legit spoil everything right away, but I really liked how, in order to defeat this evil entity, certain steps have to be taken. And so the main character is taking these steps without any of us realizing that she's taking these steps. In fact, it's almost unclear as to whether or not she knows she's taking these steps until the very end, when the good guy / bad guy, like, there are quite a few antagonists, not necessarily villains, but antagonists. And so I don't know really how I'm supposed to feel about him, if I'm supposed to like him, sympathize with him, or be like, oh my gosh, you're a terrible person. When he tries to take the steps to do what he wants to do, she's already beat him to it. First, when it starts to happen and it's being revealed, I'm like, what is going on? But eventually I caught on, and I was like, okay, I see what's going on here. But yes, these Fleeting Shadows. Let me just read the book jacket for you. Helen Vaughan doesn't know why she and her mother left their ancestral home at Harrowstone Hall, called Harrow, or why they haven't spoken to their extended family since. So when her grandfather dies, she's shocked to learn that he has left everything, the house, the grounds, and the money, to her. The inheritance comes with one condition. She must stay on the grounds of Harrow for 1 full year, or she'll be left with nothing. There's more at stake than money. For as long as she can remember, Harrow has haunted Helen's dreams. And now those dreams have become a waking nightmare. Helen knows that if she's going to survive the year, she needs to uncover the secrets of Harrow. Why is the house built like a labyrinth? What is digging the holes that appear in the woods each night? And why does the house itself seem to be making her sick? On one hand, This book reminded me of The Forgotten Book by the German author whose name I couldn't begin to pronounce right now, in the sense that the main character is from a place but was taken away from this place only to have to return to it, and it's not what it seems. It is much more sinister than you would think. However, this one was definitely sinister, whereas The Forgotten Book, strange things were happening, almost nefarious things were happening, but they were not dark and deadly and evil. Well, I mean, they were, but they weren't. Anyways, you gotta watch that review if I've already put it up. If not, maybe one day I will link it. Anyways, we open with Helen in her yard digging up bones. It was a little off-putting of a beginning because I wasn't quite sure what it meant, what it was insinuating, like what about the bones? Because as she's digging up these bones, we are learning that she does something with them. Weird things are happening concerning the people around her, and how it's like about time to leave, and then they need money, but anyways, you know something's going on with her, and you know that she is having nightmares about basically Harrow Hall. The next thing we know, her stepdad Simon's coming out. Her mom has gotten a phone call saying that her father has died, and the only way to get her back to her ancestral home is basically this. So they show up, but their mother is adamant, we are not staying at this house. We will only be here for the funeral, and then we are leaving. Funeral happens. Strange occurrence occurs with Helen. One thing that she continues to experience is basically this voice that is instructing her in certain ways. Then everything ends, and her mom's like, all right, time to go. And the grandma, Iris, is like, well, you can go, but first we need to talk about something. And what that is that the grandfather had left everything to Helen, which is millions upon millions of dollars, as well as this house. But as I read from the dust jacket, the caveat is that she has to stay for a year. This year is intended for her to get to know the house, for the house to get to know her, and then at the end of the year, she will go through the ceremony, and then if she survives, she becomes the mistress of Harrowstone Hall. Let me go through some of the other characters, because there are a lot of characters. In some ways, I felt like there were too many. In other ways, I understood why we had the cast that we did. So we have Desmond and Celia, who are siblings. Their mother, Victoria, who is Helen's mother's sister. Her husband, Armani. Just kidding, his name is not Armani. His name is Roman. And he is Celia's father. Desmond is mixed. I didn't really see the point in having him mixed because Marshall only gave one instance in which she made it a point, in which she gave it credence. And for me, I feel like if you're gonna do something, if you're gonna point out certain characteristics, they need to play into the story. And the only way that it played into the story, well, okay, sort of two ways, and they're interlocking. It's his ability to get outside of this house, to be away from the family, kind of enables him to be separate and to have a different headspace about all the weirdness that's going on. But it also, like Helen, makes him feel like an outcast because she had been born at this house, and then at some point her mother had taken her away and she has no memory of it. All of the rules and regulations of this house she is completely unfamiliar with. And so he's like, you can relate to me, but you also can't relate to me. His mixed race, for me, needed to have more importance. Otherwise, like, who cares? Even Celia didn't seem to care about her dad. So, okay, spoiler, when he dies, it was like, no big deal. Nobody cared that he died. It doesn't matter if he's actually Desmond's dad or not Desmond's dad. Anyways, there's my soapbox about everything needs to matter in a book. And then we have Iris, who's the grandmother, and the husband who just died is Leopold, and he was the master of Harrowstone. His brother Eli, who, slight spoiler, he was not the master, even though he was older, because he was gay, ergo he was never going to have offspring, ergo he couldn't be master because he needed heirs. Then we have Victoria, who is Celia and Desmond's mother. Caleb, who is Victoria and then Helen's mother's sister. Helen's mother's Rachel, so I can stop saying Helen's mother. Caleb seems to be this great guy, and he is married to Sandra, and they had a daughter named Jessamine who had died recently. From there, we have Brienne, who is the witch of Harrow Hall, or the Harrow Witch. And for me, that was problematic because when we initially meet her, as I said, Helen knows absolutely nothing. It's obvious something strange is going on at this place, and she has to figure out what it is and what it has to do with her and all this good stuff. But nobody will talk about it. That's one of the rules. So that is one of the things that Desmond, even though he did and didn't grow up at Harrow Hall, he understands the rules of the manor. So when we first meet Brienne, she seems to be this person with all the answers. She's a bit mysterious, but she knows things and she's willing to divulge them to Helen. And it's because she's the witch of Harrow Hall. But my problem is because she's the witch, it's almost a title that once the previous witch dies or, relinquishes and a new one comes, they're supposed to be able to see things for how they are rather than for how they're perceived because of all the strangeness that goes on in this house. Because of how she's initially presented, I'm like, okay, so this is going to be a really important character with a lot of insight. And then all of a sudden, it's like, well, Brienne doesn't actually know how to be the witch of Harrow Hall. It's almost like she just decided because she'd grown up on the grounds that she wanted to be the witch, yet she is the witch because she is able to see the truth of things, but she doesn't actually know what it means to be the witch. So that was confusing for me. And once I saw that, I lost all trust in Brienne and I stopped caring about Brienne. And then, slight spoiler, she and Helen begin a relationship. And for me, this is one of those books that didn't need a relationship. At the end, I'm going to put a pin in that. There is something that happens at the end that essentially can't happen without their relationship. But I thought it doesn't matter enough to the overall concept of the book for it to be there. I don't know, Brienne, as a friend, she could have achieved the same thing and it wouldn't have felt as unnecessary. Like, she still could have pushed Helen because Helen, something's weird about Helen. People know it, which is why she and her parents have to continually move around because eventually nobody wants them around anymore. And so she's never had a friend. So having Brienne as a friend, I thought was just as impactful as having her as a love interest. In any case, we have Mary Beaumont. Should I talk about Mary Beaumont? Not yet. Okay, I will. Mary Beaumont, Helen Beaumont, Dr. Samuel Raymond, and then Nicholas and Annalise Vaughan. Helen comes from the Vaughan lineage, and Harrow Hall has never existed without the Vaughans, and the Vaughans have never existed without Harrow Hall. So those guys, from Mary Beaumont to Nicholas and Annalise Vaughan, are kind of the progenitors of this whole matter. They are the ones who brought forth this evil entity. They are the ones that built Harrow Hall basically in order to contain whatever this entity is. We'll get more into them later. Then with them, we have this whole host of missing young girls, including Jessamine, all of these unexplained deaths. But let's get into it. So Helen has arrived at the house. They have told her, oh, you are named as mistress of the house. Nobody really understands why, because she's not been around. And as far as anybody was concerned, Leopold, the dad, couldn't stand Rachel. She had been his favorite, And then when she left, he blackballed her. Now Helen is thinking, this must be a way to get back at my mother for whatever she did, to drag her back in and then make us pay penance for whatever is going on. We're going through the book and strange things are happening. Helen is sick all the time. A lot of rules, and one of them is you can't be out after dark, but there is somebody who's always outside. We do see that thing about the bones where the groundskeeper is consistently filling in the holes, and it has been happening for years, for decades, and nobody really knows why, but it is becoming more frequent. Desmond and Celia, they're technically not at the house full time. They are in school. So we meet them for the funeral. They go off to school. Helen meets Briony. Briony gives her Nicholas's journal, but it is written in code. Helen, who doesn't really know Desmond, but had noticed him writing in code in his own journal, was like, hey, can you decode this for me? And he like fangirls because he's been looking for this journal like basically his whole life. He starts to decipher this journal, and that is where we start to learn about Nicholas. But before I get into him, we've already begun to learn about what the other is. The other is this creature that is contained within Harrow Hall, and Harrow Hall is likened to a maze in which Dr. Raymond had helped create something about chaos, but sanity and containment, almost like a prison, but not a prison. We really don't know what the other is, but then Helen, she's still having these nightmares. She will wake up outside. She has no idea how she got there. She encounters some really strange things in the hallway, like dangerous things. She gets bitten by this creature, and it's like, I don't know, it's hard to explain things without getting into too much, but basically this creature bites her, and trying to decide if I should reveal too much. I won't yet. So this creature bites her. It's basically a fatal bite. Eli and I think Caleb, or maybe it's Roman, they find her, they take her somewhere. She doesn't know where because she's basically in and out of consciousness. And the next thing she knows, it's a week later. Everybody's acting like everything's fine. Here is where things really start to pick up. Nicholas and Annalise had kind of been obsessed with the occult. And Annalise was something of a medium. And they were obsessed with, I don't quite know what they were obsessed with. It wasn't necessarily eternity, but like some other astral plane and encountering this other god. And actually this whole book is based off of another story. The story is The Great God Pan by Arthur Machen, or Machen, don't really know. There's a man is invited by his friend to observe a procedure that the friend has devised, one that he believes will allow the subject to look upon the face of a god. His subject is a teenager named Mary. They do a lobotomy, which will essentially allow her to disconnect enough from her human self to interact with this god. After the lobotomy, the girl is later found to be pregnant, but that child is not entirely human. So that is essentially what Nicholas and Annalise are trying to do. They bring in Dr. Raymond, who has a ward, Mary Beaumont. I would have liked more about Mary. She's portrayed very cryptically. At first, you're just like, oh, he's got this ward. She may or may not be a willing participant in what's going on. But then Nicholas is talking about how weird she is, but then he starts like daydreaming about doing stuff with her, but she creeps him out. In any case, they perform the lobotomy. They figure out what it will require to get her to I guess interact with this god in some way. I'm still a little confused, but it's something about she can't retain her full human consciousness. So as soon as they perform the lobotomy, she has the encounter that they desire her to have, and then she's pregnant. Of course, Helen and Desmond think that she's pregnant with Nicholas's kid, which I'm still a little unsure about, which I'll get into. But the child is born, there's something wrong with this child, and it's very reminiscent of how people react to Helen. Mary dies, but the child is named Helen. So Mary Beaumont, Helen Beaumont, this is where Helen gets her name. Nicholas and Annalise take care of her, and then they're like, I think this evil entity from this god is in this child, and so we need to get rid of this child. This is where the building of the house comes into play, and it is basically a labyrinth, just like with the Minotaur, where the evil entity is supposed to be kept at its center. You got to be able to find the center, and then there's this whole ritual which includes all kinds of different things and all kinds of different procedures and, steps. What they get from that is they have to continue killing children, but these children all have to be descendants. This is where I'm confused, is if Helen Beaumont is a product of Mary and this god, which I would have liked more about this god entity. I still don't understand what it was, why they were seeking it, what they wanted from it. But if this child, if Helen was a product of Mary and this god, how could then all these successors be Vaughans? It's unclear to me. Each master of Harrow Hall, so that they don't have to sacrifice their children, they are expected to have an affair with some lowly woman in town, and then that child will be sacrificed. And so because their one defining characteristic is really dark, like black, dark eyes. These are the list of girls that I mentioned earlier who have disappeared. But then there's Jessamine. She was sacrificed because the event that caused Rachel to take Helen away was they were going to sacrifice her. It was unsuccessful. Eli refused to let Celia be sacrificed. The other girl that they tried to sacrifice was Haley Cotter. She was an illegitimate child of Leopold, but because Leopold basically doesn't want to get his hands dirty, Eli, who had formed a close connection with Haley and Haley's mother, was tasked with cutting up the body and distributing it and doing this, following all the ritual steps. And he didn't. And so that sacrifice didn't work, which then led into Jessamine being sacrificed. And then that sacrifice didn't work. So this is why Helen was brought back, because obviously these other sacrifices, now Celia is too old, but Helen has to come back because they need her, even though she's technically too old to be a sacrifice as well, but they're going to sacrifice her anyways. Here we go, biggest spoiler. Helen is actually the other. What the other had done was it had split itself, and it took all the goodness that it contained and put itself into the form of a little girl, who then came up to Rachel and convinced her that she had this child, that she, Helen, had always been Rachel's child. There was a point, I don't know if this is true or not, because the thing about the other, about Helen, is that she can manipulate people's memories and thoughts, and the other in general, all the pieces that are left behind can distort reality. So I don't know if Helen was created and this propelled Rachel to get them to leave because her will was that we need to go, or if the men of the hall actually had tried to sacrifice her and it did not work. Somehow she was able to get away and then they left. It's not quite clear. Helen does believe that something Desmond had seen as a child was him seeing her being led into the woods to be sacrificed. I don't know. Anyways, as I said, there are certain things that were muddy and that made this book kind of hard to follow along with at times. But Helen is the other. What she had done, which was what I thought was super cool, was there's all these steps in order to become the master of Harrow Hall. One of them is you have to divulge secrets. So earlier in the novel, in her attempts to learn things in a roundabout way, she had gathered Brienne, Celia, and Desmond, and they played the game Never Have I Ever, which I thought was really strange. Because I know they brought some alcohol into it, but if they're not going to talk about it under normal circumstances, how will Never Have I Ever loosen their tongues even before they've had enough to drink that they don't realize their tongues are loosened? Anyways, there had been another moment where she had gotten scratched, and one thing you have to do is you have to mark somebody else, mark the sacrifice with your blood. She had been picking at her scab, and then she had hugged her Uncle Caleb, getting her blood on him. One of the other parts of the ritual is you have to sacrifice something of your own flesh and blood, and then you also have to have like an artifact of your sacrifice. And so what she had done when she'd gotten bit, they had brought her into this heart of Harrow Hall and cut off her hand. Her hand was already there. She had put the pieces together because all of these figments kept talking about being scattered. And as I said, the book opened with her digging up bones of a fox. And so she, like, bones sing. Like, she feels bones. She can commune with bones. So when she realized that what she needed to do, that what these holes that kept appearing were actually these shadows trying to find the bones, she was like, okay, we got to go get these bones because these must be the bones of the victims. Earlier, found the heart. She had found the skulls of all of these victims. She had reunited them with their bones. She had found artifacts of past victims. And what she did was, in the original ritual, she was supposed to list all of the previous masters of Harrow Hall, but then what she did was she actually listed the names of the victims of Harrow Hall. So without us realizing it, and I mean, in some ways, I don't know what she knew what she was doing or not, because there are retrospect moments where she's like, I set all of this up. It's like, did she or didn't she? You read this book, you decide. I feel like I'm getting super off track and confusing, but it's a confusing book. It's Caleb, who initially hadn't wanted to be the master of Harrow Hall, now thinks that for the good of humanity, what he needs to do is sacrifice Helen because Helen isn't real. Basically like, well, I beat you to it. And then the last thing she has to do is like release her hold on her human form. She kills Caleb, she kills Iris, she tries to kill Victoria, but Desmond stands in the way and is like, please don't. Not Armani. Why do I keep wanting to call him Armani? Roman has already died. Rachel and Sandra, I don't believe they die. But what I thought was really interesting about Sandra is that she's actually a descendant of Dr. Raymond, and really the whole thing was just to keep the bloodlines close. As much as you think she is mourning the death of her child, it's just like Caleb, where they both understood what needed to be done. And then Roman himself was a distant cousin, and he had married Victoria because he wanted to be the master of Harrow Hall. He wanted the money, the power. And so he ingratiated himself into this family. Like, he even changed his last name so that he could be a Vaughan, because only a Vaughan could become the master of Harrow Hall. Which all of that, I don't know. Like, I thought some of it came a little too late. Goes on this killing spree. Rachel, upon learning the truth that Helen wasn't actually her daughter, rejects Helen. But then on some level, they both recognize that there was some love between them. I don't know. So everybody goes away. Helen destroys Harrow Hall. Then she kind of just simmers. She broods. Like, on one hand, it sounded like it took hundreds of years. And then on the other, Brienne shows back up. So this is going back to what I was trying not to spoil earlier. And she's like, but you are a real person. Like, you are worthy. Your mother doesn't hate you. You just need to go back and see her, blah, blah, blah. And then Simon had been kind of a creation of Helen's, a stabilizer for the two, somebody to make Rachel feel loved and safe. And this also angered her towards Helen because she was like, oh, you had to make up a man for me and blah, blah, blah. And so because of Brienne and her, I guess, her love for Helen and Helen's love for her, Helen was able to resume her human form and live happily ever after. This is really where some of my issue came in, because there was no, in my opinion, real resolution about the other. Is it a good entity? Is it a bad entity? It obviously wasn't destroyed, but I don't know. Like, I was really confused by this ending. And that was probably the most dissatisfactory part for me, outside of my initial confusion as to how certain events were actually playing out. Like, it was very hard to picture in my mind. It felt like we were jumping around from here to here to here, and people were around that shouldn't be around, but how could they be around when they're not supposed to be there? And it was kind of chaotic. It was explained in the end, you know, when we learned what Simon really was, and then when we learned what all of these strange entities and all these strange goings on in the house were really. And so, like, I liked that eventually she does set things straight without, like, sitting us down and setting them straight. She just starts to take those breadcrumbs and form them into something. But the end, I didn't get. The end, I didn't like. Kind of would have preferred if Helen had just stayed a very malevolent spirit until the end of time and nobody wanted to come near the remains of Harrow Hall. I hope I remembered to touch back on all the things that I tried to put a pin in, but we know me. So if I missed anything, let me know. If I completely confuse you, let me know. I will try to do a better job in explaining the whole thing about Helen being the other. I didn't really like. I would have preferred for her to have been an actual being that had then been possessed by the other, and then somehow that was resolved by, like, the other, yes, being completely destroyed, because you just feel like the other isn't supposed to be good. Like, the god isn't supposed to be good, even though the other had done not good things, but, like, in the past, its creations had been relatively benign. But then the longer they went without a true sacrifice, the pieces of the other that were Helen and then the other pieces that were left behind stayed separated, the more malevolent things got. And there were a lot of really interesting aspects, a lot of things that I liked about Helen that you just kept wanting more from, because you wanted to know what happened with her and the girl in the second grade. You wanted to know, why do people love her immediately but then hate her? Why are people automatically repelled by her? Like, what is it about her? Sometimes writers are just melodramatic in making it sound like their characters are unlovable when really they're not. But Helen really was. Like, there was something in her that people could sense. I would have preferred it to have been sacrifice gone bad. She was overtaken by this spirit, and that's how things started to go wrong, and now it was up to Helen to destroy the spirit so she could be whole. Anyways, there we go. These Fleeting Shadows. I cannot wait to return it to the library. What is your favorite spooky novel? I love a good ghost story. I'm ready for one. So I'll see you later. Bye.